Welcome to episode 178 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It is April 27, 1974. Old Trafford, Manchester United against Manchester City. And the image that survives this day is almost too cruel to be real. Denis Law, one of the great kings of Old Trafford, in sky blue now, backheeling the ball past Alex Stepney with 8 minutes left in a derby that United have to win, then refusing to celebrate because he thinks he has just sent his own old club down. It's one of the most famous goals in English football history, not because it was the best, but because it hurt in so many directions at once. To understand how we got here, you have to begin with Denis Law, before he became Denis Law of Manchester United. He started his rise at Huddersfield, under Bill Shankly. Then, in 1960, he moved to Manchester City for a British record fee. A year later, he went to Torino. And then Matt Busby brought him back to Manchester, only now in red, in 1962. That is one of football's great route maps. City to Torino to United, and then later back to City again. And at United, he became not just successful, but monumental. He scored 237 goals in 404 appearances, won the league in 1965 and 67, helped win the FA Cup in 63, and then became part of the Holy Trinity alongside George Best and Bobby Charlton. He was the king of Old Trafford. But by the early 1970s, the club around him had changed. As we talked about in episode 75, Busby's great rebuild from Munich to the European Cup had ended in triumph in 1968, but succession proved poisonous. Busby stepped away, hovered in the building. Wilf McGuinness struggled. Frank O'Farrell did not last. And then came Tommy Docherty. United was still huge, still famous, still emotionally loaded with the memory of greatness, but they were no longer structurally sound. The old operating system had gone, and by 1974, relegation was no longer an outlandish fantasy. It was a real danger. Law himself was no longer the old Law either. Injury had bitten hard. United let him go in 73, and City brought him home for one last season. He helped City reach the 1974 League Cup final and earned a place in Scotland's World Cup squad. So when City arrived at Old Trafford on April 27, they were not chasing anything dramatic in the league, but Law was still part of the cast, and that alone made the day unstable. Now add the derby itself. As we discussed exactly 100 episodes ago, so in episode 78, Manchester derbies do not simply inherit intensity, they accumulate it. This one had already gathered history from the first Newton Heath versus Ardwick meetings, from the post-war ground share, from the best Pardo collision in 1970, and from all the other moments in which the city had tested itself through football. But April 27, 1974 was different. This was not just local pride, this was survival. United needed to win to keep any realistic hope alive. City, in pure table terms, were the freer side. That imbalance sharpened everything. The match was tight, nervous and scoreless, deep into the second half. And then came the move. With 9 minutes left, City worked the ball to Francis Lee, who squared it into the area. Law, instinctively, did what great forwards do before other people have even understood the chances there. He met it with a backheel and flicked it beyond Stepney. That was the goal. No great backswing, no thunderbolt, just touch, angle, and cruelty. Gerald Sinstad's commentary gave the moment its permanent line. Denis has done it! And for a second, time really did seem to stop. City's own history says Law could barely trudge back to the center circle. He didn't celebrate. He looked broken by it. Everyone in the ground believed, or wanted to believe, that this was the goal that had relegated Manchester United. Law believed it too. And then he was taken off. And that detail matters because it adds one more oddness to an already surreal afternoon. Within moments of scoring, Law was substituted, and soon afterwards, United fans invaded the pitch. There were multiple incursions. Referee David Smith eventually abandoned the game with 5 minutes left. And yes, some supporters appeared genuinely to have hoped that abandoning the match might force a replay. But whether that was the crowd's logic or only later folklore, it changed nothing. The Football League let the results stand. Law's goal did not mathematically relegate United. Birmingham City's win over Norwich City condemned them anyway, and other results meant that even a United victory over City would not have saved them. So the legend is truer emotionally than mathematically. Law did not send United down on his own. He gave relegation its unforgettable face. So what did the day become? It became the defining image in derby lore. There have been bigger scorelines. There have been title deciders, FA Cup finals, and power shifts. But few derby moments carry so much contradiction in one frame. A former City player turned United icon, then returned City veteran, hurting the club that adored him, while looking more miserable than triumphant. That is why the goal lives. It is not just famous, it is tragic. The Guardian's history of meaningful Manchester derbies places it exactly where you would expect, among the fixture's canonical episodes. Also, it became one of football's most persistent myths. The story is always told as Denis Law relegating Manchester United with his last kick in football. That is almost right, but not quite. It was his last touch in league football, and it was the touch anyone remembers. But he still went to the World Cup with Scotland that summer, and then played 2 Texaco Cup matches for City in August, before retiring later that month. So he didn't stop because he was miffed about being substituted, and not because he refused to celebrate. He played on briefly, but in symbolic terms, this was the end. No later appearance could compete with that backheel. Finally, it became a hinge in the longer history of both clubs. For United, the reverberation was huge, but the exile was short. They won the second division title in '75 and came back immediately. Docherty later restored some swagger and won the '77 FA Cup, but the true dynastic answer to the post-Busby collapse did not arrive until Alex Ferguson, then not immediately. Ferguson's first major trophy came in 1990, and the Premier League empire followed in the 90s and 2000s. For City, none of the future was obvious in 1974 either. They would win the League Cup in '76 and finish second in '77, but then came years of drift, relegations, and reinventions before the Abu Dhabi era and Guardiola turned them into one of the dominant clubs of the current age. Between Ferguson's United and modern City, Manchester has swallowed an extraordinary amount of English silverware. United have 20 league titles overall, including 13 Premier Leagues. City have 10 top-flight titles overall, with 4 consecutive Premier League titles from 2021 to 2024. And maybe that is the best way to understand April 27, 1974. Not as a simple act of betrayal, because it wasn't that. Law did not celebrate. He didn't posture. He didn't turn to the Stratford end and soak in the pain. He looked wounded by what he had done, even while doing the one thing a forward is born to do. It is the saddest backheel in football history. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 27, 1974. First, Denis Law's goal is immortal, not because it alone sent United down, but because it gave relegation a perfect and unbearable image. Second, the moment only works if you know the full arc. City, Torino, United greatness, Busby's shadow, United's decline, and Law's return home, the blue. Third, the match sits where all the great derbies live, at the point where football stops being just sport and becomes civic memory, family argument, and local mythology. On this day in 1974, Denis Law scored with an instinctive backheel for Manchester City at Old Trafford, refused to celebrate against his former club, and gave the Manchester Derby the most poignant goal in its history. That is all for episode 178 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history. Tomorrow, go to April 28, 1923, when Wembley was inaugurated, and a white horse, which wasn't white at all, became legend. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. See you tomorrow.